Dr. David Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I find that from the Minister rather extraordinary, the suggestion that this reduces compliance somehow, that it makes things simpler, when the evidence presented by the Speaker prior, my colleague Grant Robertson, pointed clearly to the strange legal concoction that sits in this bill, the notion of feeling the greatest connection to a property, something that appears in no other legislation, and something that makes the definition of a main home very vague indeed. And I want to just reflect for a minute on the kinds of greatest connection people might feel to explore this loophole. I suspect for many speculators, the properties with which they will feel the greatest connection are the ones they make the most money from, because that's why they're connecting to the New Zealand property market. It will have very little to do with where their family are living. It will have very little to do with those things that we might regard, those of us who live in one home and own one home, as the reasons for connecting to a home. Mr. Speaker, this legislation is designed, it seems, to have big loopholes in it. It is designed in a way that will not collect the kind of information that the public is very interested in. The register of buyers that has been sought for some time. It is legislation that will encourage offshore parties to obtain New Zealand bank accounts for no practical reason, to make no use of the accounts other than to obtain an IRD number. And it is legislation that is unlikely to achieve its goal. Those who wish to exploit the loopholes are given every encouragement through this legislation. It is not, as the Minister suggested, legislation that will reduce compliance or make life easier and simpler. It is bad legislation, and we on this side of the House are opposed to the putting through of bad legislation. The only reason that we will be issuing any support for this bill is because it is a gentle step along the way. It is highly likely that a future government will be back here correcting the mistakes in this legislation, that a future government will be making it legislation that reduces compliance and that actually achieves the principles that were laid out in the arguments for having such legislation in the first place. And I hope that government will be a Labour government, because I doubt very much that this government will have the audacity to come back again in such short time to correct legislation with so many loopholes and impracticalities about it. I wonder what other reasons for greatest connection might be, Mr. Chair. Why else would people have reasons for great connection with properties, and what legal issues will be fought, what tests will be put in place to understand what the most legitimate reason for the greatest connection to a property is? It seems an entirely subjective test on the surface, and is going to require a great deal of legal debate and probably litigation to sort out what that might mean in different contexts. It is very strange that the main home has been exempt. People who have a main home here are highly likely to already have a bank account and an IRD number. Simply to complete the purchase of the original home, I would suggest for most people involves a bank account in New Zealand, most New Zealand citizens in any case. So this legislation is vague, open to misunderstanding and confusion, and although it does improve on the current lack of information regarding overseas house purchases, it is needlessly weak and a half measure the kind of half measure we are coming to expect from this government. And it's disappointing, I guess, that we will find ourselves revisiting it before too long, when we could be doing it properly in the first place at more limited expense to Parliament, rather than spending the $1 million or more it costs to put through a new piece of legislation to tidy up after this minister. So I would ask the minister again what she understands by the greatest connection to the property, how that will be legally defined, what kinds of debates she expects will happen before that definition is tied down. These are questions which this Parliament needs answers to if we're to understand how this legislation will work.